Okay, that's it for me. Thank you for being here, Patrick. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna. And it is indeed a pleasure to be here tonight to share with you some thoughts on preparing a farm produce food safety plan. I'm Patrick Byers. I'm a horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm based in Webster County here in Southwest Missouri. I cover a number of counties in my region from the standpoint of commercial horticulture programming, and I also work statewide in Missouri on produce food safety. So I'm wondering what your expectations are tonight, and if you expect to come out of this workshop with a full-fledged, written-down produce food safety plan, I'm afraid you'll be just a bit disappointed because that's not really the goal of our time together tonight. What I hope to do tonight is share with you the framework of a produce food safety plan, the parts that might be in that plan, but only you can prepare a produce food safety plan that's relevant for your farm. So that's the take-home message. Yes, stay with me tonight. We'll go through a lot of material, and I have to confess it's a little bit text-heavy, but that's the way it is when you're dealing with regulations, right? But take this information and personalize it, and then develop your own on-farm produce food safety plan. So let's go ahead and get started. And I'll start by sharing my screen here. Okay, Anna, can we see the presentation?
Yep, we can see it.
And the audio is okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Well, again, our topic for tonight is developing a farm food safety plan. And as Anna mentioned, this workshop is a project in coordination with Springfield Community Gardens and University of Missouri Extension. Springfield Community Gardens is a grassroots organization, and they've done amazing things in the Springfield, Greene County area from the standpoint of helping develop a localized food system. So for more information on Springfield Community Gardens and their many projects, I'll refer you to their website and to their Facebook site. And the series of workshops, including tonight's workshop, are sponsored by the USDA. And the USDA, of course, is a federal agency whose goal is to foster the development of agriculture in the United States. And they provide a number of different programs for farmers of all scale, including very small scale localized farmers. A good overview of USDA programs is found at the Farm Services Agency website, FSA. Two programs of particular interest to smaller scale farmers are the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the abbreviation is NRCS, and the Risk Management Agency, the RMA. And again, for more information on all of these USDA programs, the farmers.gov website will be very helpful. And again, as Anna mentioned, at the conclusion of our workshop, we would appreciate if you would take the survey. It provides us valuable feedback that we can share with the USDA as our sponsor for this workshop. Now, again, I'm a University of Missouri field specialist in extension, working with commercial horticulture. I've been doing this for nearly 33 years now. And my time, though, as a produce food safety specialist is a bit more recent. I've been doing this since 2009. And then I'm also a farmer. So I feel that this combination of aspects of my background is helpful from the standpoint of, first of all, understanding some of the realities that our farmers face, and secondly, understanding some of the requirements of these various programs. Now, here's what I'd like to cover tonight. And first of all, we'll talk about why an on-farm food safety plan might be relevant for you. Then we'll go into some specific aspects of the food safety plan. We'll talk about some introductory materials that will be in your plan. And then we'll talk about an emphasis on land, worker health and hygiene, restrooms and sewage, water, animals, manure, harvesting and packing equipment and containers. And then we'll finish up with some thoughts on validating a produce food safety plan through a traceability program. And then we'll conclude with some resources. Now, again, we'll be stopping several times during the course of the presentation to take questions, and please feel free to type those at any time into the Q&A box. And when we pause, we can go ahead and address those questions. So I guess the first thing to think about is, why would I as a farmer consider developing a farm food safety plan? It's a bit of work. It's not something that's static. It has to be updated and reviewed regularly. It requires, quite frankly, some resources to pull it off successfully. So why would, why would I consider this? Do I really need this? So let's take a look at 3 scenarios. So the first scenario, a farmer wants to sell produce to a market that requires that farmer to have a third-party food safety audit. In other words, they have to undergo a GAPS audit or a Primus audit or some other third-party audit. Well, the answer here to this question is yes, you will need a farm food safety plan. Almost all third-party audits require a farm food safety plan. So if this is in your future or something that you might consider, then there's definitely a benefit to having that farm food safety plan in place. The second scenario, a farm is subject to the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule, and the farmer is interested in complying with all the requirements of the produce safety rule. Does this farmer have to have a farm food safety plan? The answer here is no. The produce safety rule does not require a farmer to have a farm food safety plan. A third scenario, small-scale farmer selling direct to consumers. The farm is not subject to the produce safety rule. Are they required to have a farm food safety plan? Well, again, the answer here is no. So again, we see 3 different scenarios here and different answers here. But the bottom line, is a farm food safety plan a good idea? Well, what do you suppose the answer is here? The answer is always yes. It's a very, 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 very good idea to have a farm food safety plan. And hopefully at the conclusion of our workshop tonight, you will see the benefits, the advantages, the incentives to having a farm food safety plan. Now, the reasons for a farm food safety plan. First of all, it gets you organized and focused on food safety. There are many farmers in Missouri that have been through the 8-hour mandatory produce safety rule training, and this is great. But this training, online trainings, other types of trainings tend to be general in nature. They don't tend to be focused on you and your realities on your farm. And a farm food safety plan allows you to focus on your farm and helps you describe the risks that you have identified on your farm and the actions that you're going to take to address those risks. It looks at your practices, your policies, and your standard operating procedures. Yes, it does take time and requires resources, but in the long run, putting this plan together enables you to make most efficient and effective use of your time and resources. It helps you prioritize the risks that you identify and the plan that you have in place to address those risks. It's also a great way to be prepared. Sooner or later, you're going to get questions about produce food safety. Produce food safety is very much in the minds of buyers. It's very much in the minds of consumers. There will be questions, and having a farm food safety plan in place is an excellent way to be prepared. As mentioned before, if a third-party audit is in your future, then a farm food safety plan is important from this aspect. And again, food safety regulations, in some cases, having that farm food safety plan in place can help you satisfy these regulations. Now, I mentioned the importance of you. Now, keep in mind that your farm is unique. There is no other farm like your farm. And the practices to reduce risks on your farm are specific to your farm. Yes, you can talk to someone like me or to other farmers and get a feel for good ways to manage risk, but you have to personalize these recommendations to your farm. And again, identifying and reducing risk is best done by someone who knows your farm and how it operates. The other thing that's important to recognize is each commodity is different. And many farms are a mix of a number of different commodities. So again, the produce food safety issue on your farm with your product mix is going to be unique. Some produce items grow on the ground, some grow in trees, some are harvested by hand, some are harvested by machines. In some cases, a single harvest is done. In other cases, there might be multiple harvests. And all of these commodity characteristics have an impact or have a reality from the standpoint of produce food safety. So again, when you develop your farm food safety plan, you're certainly going to look at the farm, but you're also going to look at the mix of crops that you're growing on the farm. Now, each farm needs to have a food safety person. Okay, that's the person whose responsibility is produce food safety. And that person is going to be the person who's going to lead the development of the farm food safety plan. Now, does that mean that that person's the only person involved in this? Of course not. All people who are involved in the farming operation will need to support that farm food safety plan. And in some cases, there may need, well, in most cases, there needs to be a backup plan in place. There may be a situation where the lead person is not available and a scenario arises, or whatever the situation might be. It's always good to have leadership that is more than one person, that is several people deep. The person who is the food safety person should have food safety training and experience. And a great part of food safety training experiences is understanding how to assess risks. And then secondly, how to develop a plan to address those risks. This person should have the authority to make changes if necessary, and not just to make changes, but to invest resources into these changes to reduce risks. This person also has the responsibility of making sure that the plan is put into place. And they need to be the farm food safety contact. If there's ever a question from the public or heaven forbid from an attorney, this person needs to be the person that is designated as the farm food safety contact person. Now, knowledge, of course, is your friend. And when we start to think about a farm food safety plan, it's going to be a comprehensive project. And this plan, writing this plan can be difficult, but you have to start. You need to pick a starting point, and you start with the information that you know. So as we go through the different sections of the produce food safety plan that I'm going to describe tonight, we'll want to notice that we start with generalities and then we work towards specifics. And then keep in mind that assessing risks means that you have to understand risks. And this requires knowledge and information as well. And for many people, developing this plan may be a new practice, and maybe a new exercise. You may never have done anything like this before. Does that mean that you should not get started? Of course not. The first step in developing a produce food safety plan is to get started. Keep in mind, there are lots of resources, which we'll go over here in our time together. And there are resource people out there that are ready and willing to provide assistance. But that doesn't substitute for the fact that this is your plan and that you have to develop it. So what are the parts of a farm food safety plan? Well, here are some general thoughts. Now, does this mean that your plan has to look exactly like the plan I'm describing tonight? Of course not. But these are the general parts that you will find in farm food safety plans. First of all, there'll be information on the farm itself, the name and address, description, commodities grown, the size of the farm. There'll be name and contact information for the farm food safety manager. Then there'll be a general risk assessment of practices and environmental conditions on the farm that impact food safety. Then you'll be talking about the practices you have in place to reduce these identified risks. And then, of course, there's records. Record keeping is an important aspect of a farm food safety plan. And in fact, the plan is a very convenient place to store these records. We'll talk more about this in a moment as well. Some other things to include in your farm food safety plan: farm maps, farm policies, standard operating procedures, records of the trainings that you provide to the people who work on the farm, your water test results, emergency contact information, things such as emergency contact information for the person who's maintaining your porta potty or the person who's supplying your agricultural chemicals. Should be information on suppliers and buyers. Your traceability and your recall plan should be in your farm food safety plan. And then again, contact info for any contracted services. Okay, so the basic steps in putting together your farm food safety plan. First of all, the first step is assessing risks. And there are risks and then there are risks. And so it's important, first of all, to take a look at your farm operations, what you do on your farm. And by doing this, you can identify practices and conditions that may contribute to or increase produce safety risks. You're certainly going to look at the farm environment. You're going to look at what's going on around the farm. The focus, yes, is on microbial risks, but you also want to keep in mind chemical risks and physical risks. For example, is there the risk of off-farm pesticides drifting onto the farm? Or are there physical risks that you need to consider? Now, once you've identified these risks, you want to prioritize them. How do you prioritize a risk? Well, first of all, the ones that rise to the top are the ones that are likely to occur, okay, the ones that you can with some accuracy predict could happen. And then those risks that rise to the top are the ones that jeopardize a large part of a crop or perhaps even the entire farm. So again, because time and money are limited, it's important to prioritize risks. Now, again, some more thoughts on ranking risks. The risks that lead to whole crop contamination rise to the top. Those risks that have caused problems in the past rise to the top. And then if you've changed some way that you do on the farm recently, if you're trying a new piece of equipment, for example, if you're hiring new people, if you're changing suppliers, those could contribute to the priority of a particular risk. So again, these are the ways that you look at risks and you prioritize them. Those are the risks that you address first in your farm food safety plan. The second step is to develop practices to reduce your risks, okay? Now, these, going through this risk identification and risk prioritization exercise is very helpful, but that's just the starting point. Now we need to figure out ways to manage risk. And certainly there are resources and trained people out there that can help you. You need to know what resources are required to implement practices. Perhaps we need people, perhaps we need money or time. Perhaps we need to purchase some equipment. Maybe we need to have added infrastructure. Maybe we need to upgrade something that we're using. Maybe it's something as simple as disposables, more hand soap, a reliable supply of paper towels, things like that. Okay, then we create a list of tasks or steps that need to be done, and we designate a person to be in charge of each task. All of this is written down. All of this becomes part of the farm food safety plan. The third step is to document and revise. So now we're going to actually write the plan. Okay, we've identified risks, we've developed ways to manage risk. Now we write it all down and we develop the plan. Okay, so standard operating procedures. So standard operating procedures are the way, it's a roadmap to a goal. Okay, and when you write down a standard operating procedure, there's an expectation that people will follow that this is going to be the way that things happen on the farm. We also need in place policies. Okay, policies are there in an overarching fashion to help govern standard operating procedures, but also to help address situations that might arise that can't be reasonably foreseen. So in other words, you have your produce food safety person identified. That person has a role to play if an unforeseen situation develops. Record keeping. Again, record keeping is just part of the reality of growing and marketing produce today. And it's important to build record keeping into the logical flow of activities in your plan. Now, a plan is not a static document. It needs to be revised. It needs to be regularly visited to make sure that it's still relevant. And it may be necessary to revise your plan. If practices change on the farm, if you add new crops, if you change marketing strategies, you'll need to revise your plan. If problems occur that the plan can't address, then you may need to revise your plan as well. Now, how frequently should you review the plan? At least annually, okay, at least once a year. But if you make changes in practices, if you bring on new people or equipment changes, then it may be time to review and update the plan. So again, make sure that plan is current, make sure the plan is relevant to your current and future realities. Now, some educational resources. Again, there are lots of resources available to help you to develop your on-farm food safety plan. Now, these resources include resources through land-grant institutions and extension programs, both here in Missouri and across the country. If you're interested in a third-party audit, then that organization will also provide information on developing your farm food safety plan. In fact, you can pattern your plan on the audit instrument, the test, if you want to call it that you'll have to take for your farm to achieve a third-party audit. You can develop your farm food safety plan based upon that outline. There's also information available from industry and commodity-specific organizations, trade organizations. The federal government has provided information through FDA, USDA. And then there's independent organizations that can assist. For example, Farmers Union here in Missouri has a vested interest in produce food safety. They've developed resources that are available to help guide farmers through the farm food safety plan development process. Now, as far as actually physically developing the plan, you can sit down with a spiral, you can sit down with a handheld device, you can sit down with a laptop or a desktop computer and write. Use whatever works for you, okay? All of these are possibilities. I've worked with farmers who have written out their farm food safety plans in longhand in a spiral notebook with dividers, and that works great for them. And then I've seen very sophisticated farm food safety plans based upon word processing programs and spreadsheets. So again, whatever works for you. Templates, a word on templates. So there are a number of templates available that you can download and personalize, and that can be a great way to start the process. Now, does that mean that you just take a template and fill in your name where there's blanks? Of course not. The template has to be tailored to meet your realities. So yes, a template can be a great place to start, but it's just a starting point. And the finished product has to be your farm, not the template. Now, in addition to an actual plan template, there are templates for record keeping logs. There's templates for standard operating procedures. All of these are great ways to get started. They're great places to start. And it can be easier than trying to build the plan from scratch. But again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make sure that that plan is your plan, okay? So you have to develop it. Yes, start with a template, but make sure that you customize it. Make sure that you know what's in the plan and make sure that it will work for you. Okay, let's pause for a moment here. Do we have any questions at this point, Anna?
We don't have any questions right now. If anyone does have questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen.
Very good. Well, we'll pause frequently here from here on out for the rest of the workshop to ask questions. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box. Okay, now let's look at the particular parts of a produce food safety plan, a farm food safety plan. The first section is the introduction. And almost universally, the templates will include these pieces of information. First of all, the name of your farm and a mission statement. In other words, why you're doing what you're doing. Then there'll be information for the owner and their contact information. And then the organizational information. What type of a business structure do you have for the farm, for example? Do you have people who are assigned to particular aspects of your farm? All of that information will be included here. There needs to be information on the history of your farm, such as your starting date. Information on the physical location, so certainly a written description, but this is a great place to include maps. And again, throughout the Farm Food Safety Plan, maps can be an excellent way to graphically illustrate standard operating procedures or the layout of things such as water distribution systems, buildings, equipment storage, all of these things. So don't be afraid to use maps. Don't be afraid to use graphical resources in your farm food safety plan. And then you need a description of your farm facility. You certainly need information on water sources and water distribution systems, information on the buildings that you're using in the farm operation, information on production sites. Do you have high tunnels? Do you have fields? Do you have beds? The various production areas that you can break out and delineate. That should be done in the introduction to your produce food safety plan. Now, to dig a little deeper into land. Now, again, land is the basis for production, and it's a very important aspect of produce food safety. And again, the reason that we focus on land in this particular section is to ensure that best management practices and risk reduction methods are employed while we're using that land to produce crops. Okay, we also want to make sure that the land and adjacent land is suitable for and doesn't pose a risk to the production of safe commodities that are intended for human consumption. So again, that's a fancy way of saying that we have to take a close look at the land base that we're using for crop production and make sure that there aren't risks there. And if there are risks, then we need to address those risks. What are some of the concerns? Well, primarily contamination from microbial, chemical, or physical contaminants. Now, what can be the source of these contaminants? Certainly previous land use. And the produce food safety plan needs to have information on the history of different areas of the farm. This can be a great place to keep the records of your crop rotations. It's also a great place to chart history when land is brought into cultivation. You know, was it a pasture? Was it a forested area? Was it an area where there were livestock kept? All of this can be included in this particular section. We need to look at adjacent land. Is there issues with poor agricultural practices? Could there perhaps be a risk of unintended chemical drift onto a production field from adjacent land? What about animal livestock and the interface between animals and produce? Could there be a situation where there might be fecal matter movement, either on farm or from adjacent land? And is there any risk from flooding or unusual rain events? You know, is this something that you can reasonably foresee? So again, this is what you're focusing on primarily here in this particular section. So what would your plan have? Well, it's going to have a history of your farm, including the previous uses of production fields. It's going to have information on what's going on around your farm. You're going to look at what your neighbors are doing. You're going to write that down. You're also going to look at what you're doing in non-crop production areas, you know, our areas in pasture. You have particular areas where livestock are kept, particularly in concentrated numbers, that might be a risk. And then you're going to look at flooding risks, and you're going to note in the plan, you know, I have a bottomland field that could be subject to flooding, or I've taken efforts, I've built dikes, whatever it might be, to mitigate the risk of flooding. But keep in mind, the flooding poses some significant and unique risks from the standpoint of produce food safety. Okay, do we have any questions related to how we're going to describe the land base in our produce food safety plan?
No, not right now.
Okay, very good, thank you. The next thing we'll look at is worker health and hygiene. And the reason that we focus on this is that much of the contamination that we see on produce, biological contamination, is a result of fecal contamination. And it follows what's called the fecal-oral route of contamination. Somehow, contamination in feces gets onto crops, and then when people consume those crops, they become ill. So it's very important to have a significant section in your on-farm food safety plan that's focused on worker health and hygiene. The concern again here is that these crops, first of all, are consumed raw, and secondly, hands touch these crops, okay? And workers have direct access to the entire food supply chain. It's not just harvesting, but it's at every step along the way. And so it's important that there be a focus on worker health and hygiene. This is a significant risk. The potential is there for one sick person to contaminate a significant part of at least a day's harvest. So again, very important to have a focus area in the farm food safety plan on worker health and hygiene. So some things to think about relative to worker health and hygiene. There should be drinking water quality standards to make sure that contaminants are not introduced and to promote employee health. And there must be in place proper sanitation, health, and hygiene practices. And not only do these practices need to be in place, but workers, employees, and visitors must be trained to understand how these practices can limit contamination. So again, in this part of the plan, you're going to list what you're doing to avoid introducing contaminants and to promote employee health. Okay, so some examples of what are going to be in your plan. First of all, worker training program. The Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule requires farms to have an annual training of workers. And this training includes information on worker health and hygiene. And so your plan should include an outline of the curriculum that you use in your worker training program. You should also have your visitor policy in place here in this section. Now, what is a visitor policy? Well, not everyone who comes to the farm is an employee or an owner. There may be casual visitors. There may be people coming for pick your own. There may be people coming for various reasons. But it's important that if these visitors could come into contact with produce, that there be a policy in place to limit the risk that these visitors might introduce. So this particular policy needs to be in this section of your produce food safety plan. What about workers who are sick? Are you going to have a plan in place that these workers can be shifted away from produce into jobs where they don't contact produce or perhaps sent home? So again, you need to have this in the plan as well. Accident policy. even when people use care, there is the potential for accidents. And when there's an accident, there could be the loss of bodily fluids and the potential for contamination. So your produce food safety plan will need to include a section on how accidents are addressed. Not just, obviously the first step is to take care of the injured person, but secondly, how are we going to decontaminate, clean up the accident site? There must be a worker hygiene policy in place. Again, the importance of things such as hand washing, using sanitary facilities, not relieving yourself in the field, properly using toilet paper, properly using paper towels, etc., when washing hands. There should also be a break policy. The produce safety rule mandates separate break areas, and your food safety plan should indicate where those break areas are. And then there should be information on who can and cannot apply chemicals, who is going to be in charge of mixing up sanitizing solutions, applying pesticides, and other types of applications on the farm. So these are all examples of what will be in your worker health and hygiene section. Do we have any questions on this?
Not at this time.
Okay. Now let's talk about restrooms and sewage. And this is a continuation of that initial discussion on health and hygiene. Very important to recognize that sanitation facilities, first of all, must be in place, and secondly, must be properly maintained. Because if people are comfortable using these facilities and they do a good job of using these facilities, it will minimize the risk of introducing introducing pathogens of fecal origin to produce. So again, improperly maintained sanitation facilities present opportunities to introduce pathogens. This is something we want to avoid so that it reduces contamination of produce. And also, we don't want people to get sick because of this. So again, having this in our plan is very important. Now, again, we know that people are a primary source of contamination of produce. And if we don't have properly managed sanitation facilities, this risk becomes a serious risk. And as far as policies and procedures, growers should list what they're doing to maintain and prevent contamination. Okay, we're going to focus on restrooms, we're going to focus on field sanitation units, and we're going to focus on septic systems that manage waste. So, what will your plan have in it? Well, it will talk about the location and the maintenance schedule of toilets. It will talk about where toilets are located relative to production areas. It's very important that toilets and places to wash hands be convenient for workers to use. And then there needs to be a plan in place to address problems. If there's an issue, for example, with a tipping over of a portable toilet or a plugged toilet that overflows or other issues that can occur with toilets or septic systems, there needs to be a plan in place to address these issues. Okay, any questions about restrooms and sewage?
Nope, no questions.
Okay. Now let's talk about water, and we could spend hours talking about water. Water, of course, is necessary for many different operations on the farm, but unfortunately, water becomes a carrier for contamination. And very quickly, a small issue can become a large issue. Water, quite frankly, is among the riskiest aspects in farming. And so deservedly, the section on water in your on-farm food safety plan will be extensive. So again, the purpose of having water in your plan is to ensure that this water that is used in the field for irrigation, frost protection, or as a carrier is of adequate quality for agricultural use. And it's also important that when we look at water for hand washing and for harvest and post-harvest use, that it be potable. Again, water is a vehicle. It spreads pathogens and can very quickly contaminate a large amount of produce. So it is a significant risk. Now, from the standpoint of contaminants, frequently we focus on biological contaminants, and this is certainly the case. Harmful pathogens of many different types, bacteria, viruses, and parasites can cause foodborne illness. In many cases, these can be spread from point or non-point sources through water. But water also poses a risk of spreading chemical contamination or soil amendment contamination. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to talk about what we're doing to protect water sources from contamination. We're going to talk about water testing procedures, and we're going to talk about the other aspects of risk management that we have underway on the farm. Okay, so some examples of what will actually be in your plan. First of all, you're going to talk about your water sources. Where does water come from? Do you use well water? Do you use surface water from a lake or a stream? Do you use water that is delivered to your farm by a city, a county, or some other governmental agency? You want to understand all of these, and you certainly want to talk about the primary water source, but also if you have backup water sources, describe those as well. If you have more than one well, describe each well. Then you're going to talk about how you use water on the farm. Do you use water to irrigate? Do you use water to apply pest management chemicals? Do you use water harvest post-harvest? Do you use water to maintain sanitary facilities? Do you use water for washing your hands? All of these need to be described in your produce food safety plan. Then you need to talk about how water is distributed on your farm. Where does the water come from? What's its source? But then how does it spread out on your farm to the various places where you use that water? You're going to look at distribution systems to irrigation, distribution systems to pack houses, distribution systems to places where you might fill a spray tank. All of these need to be described. And this is a great place, of course, for a map. Now, keep in mind that one of the requirements of the produce safety rule is an annual inspection of the water distribution system on your farm. And so if you have this map close at hand in your farm food safety plan, it's very easy to bring that out when you do your annual inspection. This is also a great place to keep a record of when these inspections take place. Water testing schedule. Very important that water be tested for quality. This helps you develop what's called the water quality profile for each water source on your farm. Now, you're not required to test water that's delivered to you by a county, a city, a water authority. It's assumed that water arrives on your farm in potable condition. But if you're using well water or if you're using surface water, then it's an excellent risk management practice to test that water with some regularity. And your protocol will be described in your on-farm food safety plan. You'll talk about the design of irrigation systems on your farm in the plan. Are you using drip irrigation? Are you using flood irrigation? Are you using overhead irrigation? You'll talk about how you use water at harvest and post-harvest. And then you'll talk about corrective actions that you take if there's a problem relative to water quality. Do we have any questions related to water?
No, we do not.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Now let's talk about animals. And it's a reality that there will be animals on the farm. In some cases, these are animals under our control, domestic animals of one type or another, or we could have wild animals that interface with produce on our farm. And it's important that we have best management practices in place to limit the potential contamination of crops by animal activities. Why is this a concern? Well, in many cases, animal feces have been directly linked to pathogen contamination of fresh fruits and vegetables. In fact, in most cases, it's related to feces, animal feces, or perhaps human feces. But at any rate, this is a significant risk and it deserves a significant place in your farm food safety plan. So again, where can these contaminants come from? Perhaps animal manure sources if you have an interface between livestock and produce. And if there's a situation where livestock or animals have access to both crop production areas and water sources, there can be a risk here as well. It may not be just direct deposition of manure in the crop, it may be contamination of the water source by the presence of animals. And then if that water is used to irrigate, it can carry contamination with it. So in your plan, you're going to talk about what you're doing to keep animals out of fields and to avoid introducing contaminants. So what is your plan going to include? Well, first of all, if you do have animal production on your farm as well as produce, you're going to locate where production areas are, and you're going to evaluate the runoff risk from those areas. And then you're going to develop ways to mitigate that situation. Secondly, you're going to talk about pre-plant inspection. This is where you look at a field before you plant the crop, and at least with some certainty, you're going to try to guess or estimate, not guess, you're going to estimate the risk that livestock or wild animals might pose for the crop that's going to be produced in that field. Is that field, for example, close to a wooded area? Can you see travel paths for animals across that field before you plant? These are all things to consider. Another very important time to inspect a field is the pre-harvest period, immediately before harvesting the crop. And this needs to be an in-depth, intensive inspection where you walk through the field and you look for physical evidence of animals. You're looking for feeding, you're looking for travel paths, and most importantly, you're looking for manure. And you'll talk about what your procedure is to address any issues that are identified during the pre-harvest inspection. Keep in mind that in every case, produce that is visibly contaminated with manure must not be harvested and used for human food. So, for example, your produce food safety plan might talk about the process where you mark areas that are visibly contaminated with manure, and you establish a buffer area where you don't harvest crop within an area where you might reasonably expect manure to have spread, where you visibly see it. Again, the mitigation plans are very important. And then pet policies, both on-farm pets, but also pets that visitors bring. You should have a policy in place in your produce food safety plan to address the issue of the presence of pets. Because just as the case with deer or cows, a dog or a cat can be a significant risk factor from the standpoint of contamination. Okay, do we have any questions related to animals?
No animal questions right now.
Okay, let's take the animal discussion one step further and talk about manure. And again, manure is an asset on the farm. It's frequently used as a nutrient source and as a soil conditioner and a source of organic matter. But manure does pose a significant risk from the standpoint of microbial contamination if it's not handled properly. So again, the purpose of this section in your produce safety plan is to provide for effective and safe applications of soil amendments, i.e. manure, while minimizing microbial hazards. Why are we concerned? Well, again, we know that manures and other soil amendments of animal origin are a potential source of human pathogen, and they can certainly contaminate the soil. So again, raw and composted manure, biosolids, other things can introduce human pathogens. And again, this is a good place to introduce the difference between compost and manure. Manure carries a risk if compost has been properly prepared. Even with a manure base, if it's been properly prepared and properly handled, that risk is greatly reduced. So an important risk management aspect of manure is to make sure that it's thoroughly composted before applying it. So again, in your food safety plan, you're going to list what you're doing to properly store and handle manure. So what might these entries look like in your food safety plan? Well, first of all, your manure use policies. You're going to be thinking about, do I even use raw manure? Or do I only use compost that has been properly prepared? This can be a significant way to manage risk. If I do choose to use manure, what are my application and harvest intervals going to be? Again, a good place to start here is to look at the National Organic Program intervals of 90 or 120 days from the application of manure to the harvest of the crop. 90 days for lower risk crops such as tree crops or trellis crops where it's unlikely that the crop will contact the soil. And then 120 days for higher risk crops, things such as leafy greens, berry crops, or crops that with some regularity might contact the soil. If you're producing compost on farm, make sure that you document the production practices that you use on farm so that if you want to make a claim that that manure or that compost is microbially safe, you can back it up with your standard operating procedure in the produce food safety plan. And then if you're using compost, describe how you use it in the plan as well. Talk about how you store manure and compost to make sure that there's no risk of cross-contamination. And then if the tools and equipment, the buckets, the equipment, the shovels, et cetera, that are being used to apply manure, you need to be discussing the cleaning and sanitizing policy in your produce food safety plan to make sure that you don't spread contamination from these tools to produce or to surfaces that might contact produce. Okay, any questions about manure?
Nope, no manure questions right now.
Okay. Now let's talk about harvest and post-harvest equipment and containers. And the purpose here, of course, is to ensure that the proper harvesting, handling, and transportation procedures are being used on your farm. And that by using these procedures, your goal is to reduce the risk of contamination, which can occur. And again, this is a significant risk. If you have a sorting table, for example, that's contaminated, it's very easy to spread a significant amount of contamination to a large part of the crop. So again, a very important aspect. Why is this a concern? Well, field packing, harvesting, and transportation activities are all contamination opportunities, okay? So again, harvesting vehicles, equipment, and then the things that you use post-harvest, things such as grading tables, sorting tables, containers, coolers, transportation equipment, all of these equipment and tools that interface with produce can carry risk. And it's very important to be aware of cross-contamination. Cross-contamination means that a contaminated surface contacts clean produce and spreads problems from the surface to the produce. And so again, a significant part of the produce food safety plan should be talking about harvest and post-harvest. And again, you're going to talk about what you're doing to maintain equipment and containers during harvesting. So some examples of what will be in your plan. First of all, that pre-harvest assessment we talked about earlier, this needs to be discussed here as well. Then we need to be talking about cleaning and sanitizing equipment and harvest containers. For example, if we're using 5-gallon plastic buckets to harvest crop, we should be talking about our standard operating procedure for when those harvest containers are cleaned and sanitized. We need to be talking about tabletop surfaces. We need to be talking about bare hands versus gloves. All of these need to be discussed from the standpoint of the produce food safety plan. What about physical and chemical contamination? We need to be thinking about things like light bulbs being protected from breaking and showering glass onto produce. And we need to be talking about how we store chemicals on the farm relative to where produce is being handled. There should always be a separate storage area for chemicals where they're not going to come into contact with produce or the packaging for produce. And then harvest containers, these should be used only for produce. And we need to be thinking about transportation from the field to other areas such as the pack house or to the market, and how we're going to make sure that we don't have contamination during transportation. For example, providing a cover can be very helpful here. Another area that I don't mention here, but I touched on in water, but I'll mention here again, very important to have in place procedures from the standpoint of using sanitizers in water that will contact produce. And this is a great place to discuss your practices as far as using only labeled materials, which materials you're using as sanitizers, how frequently you're testing those sanitizers, when you're discarding those sanitizers, what are the criteria that help you understand when to discard and change sanitizers. All of these aspects of the use of sanitizers should be included in your produce food safety plan. This is a great section in which to include those. Okay, do we have any questions about harvest and post-harvest equipment and containers?
Nope, no questions right now.
Okay, very good. Now, let's talk a bit about some more generalities here. So again, some thoughts about your plan. You've gone through this exercise, you've started with a template, you've developed all of these things that we just discussed. Here's a reality check. First of all, only include practices that you're doing on your farm. Sometimes templates come with long lists of practices. If you're not doing those on your farm, don't include them in your farm food safety plan. Don't include things that you wish you were doing. Only include things that you are doing. Keep in mind that the plan doesn't need to be long or complicated. In fact, simplicity can be very helpful when others need to understand what's going on your farm. Pick practices and schedules that you know you can do. Again, reflect your reality in your on-farm food safety plan. And again, I've said this several times, and I'll say it again. The focus of the farm food safety plan is risk reduction. That's what it's all about. Okay, so you've written your plan, you've got your practices in place, you've got those records that we've discussed, and you're growing delicious, high quality, safe produce. So what next? Is there more to be done? Well, of course there is. One more step, and that's called traceability. And when we talk about traceability, this is an understanding of where the produce comes from on your farm and where it goes when it leaves your hands. And the reason this is important is because if there's ever a problem, if there's ever an issue related to produce food safety, it's important, first of all, to understand where that problem came from, and secondly, to understand who may be impacted by that problem. So traceability is a very important aspect of the farm food safety plan. So let's talk a bit about traceability. So again, the value of traceability, first of all, it can be helpful to follow quality, and traceability is not just a produce food safety issue, it's also a quality issue. And if there's ever been a problem with quality in a portion of a crop that's been sent out, it's important to know where that went so that you can call up and contact the person who bought it or wherever it went, let them know there's an issue with quality and address that issue. If you have no clue where your crop has gone and you discover later there's a quality issue, you have no way to track down that produce. It's also helpful to keep track of what's actually sold. You know, particularly when you provide produce on consignment and you really don't know how much of it is sold, what's selling well, and how much money you should be making. So again, traceability can help you track that down as well. But again, the primary reason for a traceability program is to minimize the impact of a foodborne illness outbreak. Okay, here is where we introduce the concept of a recall. Now, traceability, the real value is understanding where produce came from and where it's gone so that you can effectively develop a recall program, okay? And the traceability program helps you understand how much was sold, how much is still in the warehouse, how much is still in the cooler at the grocery store, and how much has actually been sold to the consumer. You know, if there's an issue and the produce has not left the cooler at the grocery store, it's pretty straightforward to recall that. But if it's moved out from the grocery store into the hands of consumers, then it becomes more of a challenge. So again, the value of traceability is it helps you understand where that crop has gone. Now, is it important to know where the problem came from? Of course it is. And if you can trace back the contamination situation to a particular field, then you can help understand why that problem occurred in the first place, and you can correct that issue. Now, when we talk about product tracing, you as a farmer are not responsible for the entire system. You know, frequently there are a number of steps in the distribution of food. Yes, it starts on your farm, passes through your hand, and it goes to a purchaser. Now that purchaser may be the end user, but in other cases it may be to a grocery store, to a food service, or to a produce auction, or some other step where there'll be additional steps before it ends up in the hands of the actual consumer. So from the standpoint of product tracing, you as a farmer are really only responsible for two parts: one step back, where it came from on your farm, and one step forward, where it went when it directly left your hands. Okay, so again, from the standpoint of a farmer, you need to understand where that crop came from on your farm and who it went to, either who it was sold to or who it was delivered to. So again, you're not responsible for the entire system, just one step back, one step forward. Now, if there's a situation where you're doing a recall, where you're putting your traceability program into place and you're trying to figure out where a crop came from on your farm or where it went when you left your farm, it can be very helpful to understand what portion of a crop in a given harvest day was actually involved. And this is done by developing what's called a lot. Okay, so again, a lot is just a way of defining and following a distinct portion of the crop. So a lot might be, well, let's say, for example, we have a high tunnel full of tomatoes. A lot may be the tomatoes that were harvested between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock on a given day, okay? It's not the entire crop of tomatoes that were harvested on a given day, just the portion that were harvested between those 2 hours. Now, the reason that we want to break the whole day's harvest up into lots is if there's ever a problem and we have a whole day's harvest as the lot, we may have to trace back the entire day's harvest, and that can become a significant issue. On the other hand, if we know that the problem was confined to the part that we harvested between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock, it's a much more manageable operation to do the recall. Now, in order to make this work, we have to have what's called a clean break between lots. So what might a clean break be in our tomato harvest scenario? Let's say we start off the day with harvest at 8 o'clock. At that point, the day before, we've washed all of our harvest containers, we've washed the tables that we sort tomatoes on, and we're only using clean containers to pack the tomatoes in for market. Okay, so we're more or less starting off clean, right? Okay, then we harvest for 2 hours, we bring the fruit in, we grade it, we pack it, and we get it ready to send to market. Well, at 10 o'clock, we stop that part of the operation. We clean and sanitize the tabletops, we clean and sanitize buckets, or we only use clean buckets from that point on. And we basically separate the portion of the crop that we've harvested from the portion that we're going to harvest after 10 o'clock. We've established that clean break. And we can now say with confidence that we understand what part of this day's harvest was harvested between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock. And then we know that what was harvested from 10 o'clock on, we started off with a clean slate. And that's how a lot works. That's how a clean break works. Now, again, how big should the lot be? Yes, it's more convenient to have fewer larger lots, but on the other hand, if there ever is a recall, that means you're recalling a lot more product. So there's always a bit of a compromise between convenience and efficiency and size. So try to find what works for you. Keep in mind that the smaller the lot, the less impact there will be from a recall. Now, once you develop a system of identifying lots, then you need to develop some way to specifically identify a particular lot so that when the harvest in that lot leaves your hands, there's some way for the person who purchased that produce then to be able to trace that back to you. Okay, and this is done by developing what's called a lot code. And frequently these lot codes are alphanumeric, where they're a combination of numbers or letters. And each part of the code has a meaning, okay? Each part of the code should be able to identify things such as the farm that it came from, the field of origin on the farm, and the harvest date. Sometimes there's even more. There's identifiers of, as far as the particular product or even the particular harvest crew that harvested that product. The lot code must be unique to that specific lot. It's not something that's repeated over time. It should be unique. And it should somehow follow the lot. It should be attached to the produce. You know, for example, in the case of watermelons, it can actually be on a sticker that's attached to the watermelon, or it should be attached to the sellable container. You know, for example, if we're selling clamshells of cherry tomatoes, it should be attached to the clamshell. If we're selling a crate of cantaloupe, it should be attached to the crate. But some way it must follow the lot. So how do you develop a lot code? Well, it's a very logical process. The way you do it, first of all, is that you identify field locations, you identify commodities and varieties grown, and then a method for indicating the harvest or the pack date, and then in some cases, even the crew that harvested or packed it. But typically what we're interested in from the standpoint of where it came from, field location, the commodity, and then the harvest or the pack date. So again, that lot code is going to include at least those 3 bits of information. Let's take a look at a lot code and see how that might work. Okay, so if we look at this particular lot code here, what we see, first of all, we see the big word empire. Empire is actually a cultivar of apple. So again, we've identified what's in this particular crate. It's Empire apples. Secondly, the farm, field, or block of origin. If we look at this lot code, we see farm was the Rose Farm. Block was the first block, okay? The harvest date. How do we know the harvest date on this? Well, we have to understand, well, certainly we see October 11th, 2011 written on there, but frequently the harvest date is noted by what's called the Julian date. And the Julian date it's developed by the particular date where it falls from between 1 and 365, 1 being January 1st, 365 being December 31st. So in this case, 284 in that lot code is the same as the Julian date designation for October 11th. And so that's how a Julian date works. There may be other pieces of information on the lot code, things such as the pack house, the harvest crew, the packing date, or the packing crew. But again, the basic pieces are all here. The identifier as far as the cultivar and the crop, the location of where it was harvested from, and the date on which it was harvested or packed. So again, another example here, we see it up close here. Farm location is 10, that's the Rose Farm. The block is number 1, the fruit type is number, if we look, we're looking here at the highlighted lot code. So the farm location is designated by 10. That refers to Rose Farm. The block is 01, that's the second group of numbers in the lot code. The third, 01, is the fruit type, and the farm is chosen to identify apples as 01. 05 is the cultivar, which is Empire, and then 284, that's the Julian date for October 11th. So again, very straightforward. If you look at that and you don't know the code, it's not very helpful, but there'll be additional information on the box that enables the person who's doing the traceback to contact the farm and say, well, I have a box of lot code 1001010524 that has a problem. And the farmer can take that lot code then and then trace it back on the farm to the date which was harvested, where it came from on the farm, what commodity, what cultivar, and perhaps even who harvested it. So again, each container or lot should be identifiable, and the lot code should follow the lot. Lots of ways to get that done. And again, determine the best system for your farm. Again, you're going to look at size, markets, costs, infrastructure. Is it going to be electronic? Is it going to be paper? These are all options for you to consider. Now, this is not part of the produce, the on-farm food safety plan, but recognize that from the standpoint of the Food Safety Modernization Act, it's important that there be labeling that identifies where crop comes from. And this is labeled at the point where the produce is sold, okay? And the reason for this is that even if there's not a lot code, even if there's not a traceability program, the person who purchased that product can hopefully remember where it came from. And then they can return if there's ever an issue, because the information was prominently and conspicuously displayed at the point of purchase. Now, the final step of a traceability system and the produce food safety, or the farm food safety plan, is to validate it. And this is done by conducting a mock recall. And the way this works is you pick a lot code for something that you recently sold, call the buyer to make sure that you know receives some or all of the lot, and you tell them, first of all, you emphasize this is a mock recall, not a real recall. Then you ask them if they still have any of that particular lot on hand, how much has been sold, and then you trace that lot in your records to see where it came from. And if you can trace it forward and backward, great. Everything's working as you had planned. If there's some problem on either end, then you need to figure out what the problem is and fix it. Now, I mentioned record keeping. Record keeping is part of the reality now of growing and marketing produce. And the Farm Food Safety Plan is a great place to store those records. And here's an example of some of the records that might be in a Farm Food Safety Plan. Now, several of these are mandated by the Produce Safety Rule. And these include things such as the annual water distribution system examination, the records of wash water treatments, if you're using wash water treatments, and the record of your annual employee training. So that would be in there. But there's other records that you might want to include in there. Things such as your dates of pre-harvest risks assessments, and if you found any problems, any evidence that you've noted of animal and wildlife monitoring, your buyer contact list, your equipment cleaning logs, records of when you apply manure, records of when you clean packing houses, restrooms. If you do a mock recall, document that. If you're sending product out on trucks, make sure that you check the trucks to make sure they're clean. That's part of the produce safety plan too, is that you have a plan in place to make sure that as you transport produce that it's done in a safe fashion. The equipment lists, and particularly your water test records, all of these records should be stored in your farm food safety plan. Okay, so in conclusion, hopefully we've cleared up any questions about why you should have a farm food safety plan. Keep in mind that it helps you organize your approach to produce food safety. It's a great place to record what happened in the past, excellent place to document your current practices, And finally, it's a great way to plan the future of food safety on your farm. Remember that the Farm Food Safety Plan is not a static document. It's a living document that should be reviewed and revised as needed. And again, it's a great place to organize yourself, to store records, and to help develop your understanding of on-farm produce food safety. Some excellent references. The Missouri Department of Agriculture has been very proactive in developing produce food safety resources, and these can be accessed at their website. North Carolina Fresh Produce Safety has an excellent website as well. Kansas State University has a number of useful templates and other resources in developing the Farm Food Safety Plan. And the Produce Safety Alliance. This is an organization headquartered at Cornell University and funded through the Food and Drug Administration, has a wealth of resources relative to developing a farm food safety plan, including a very useful Farm Food Safety Plan template. So Anna, at this point, do we have any questions?
We don't have any questions right now.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us on the workshop today. Please note my contact information. And if you ever need any assistance in developing a farm food safety plan, or if you'd like someone to review your farm food safety plan, I would be very happy to help you with that. So I thank you for joining us today. And I hope that everyone, if they don't already have a farm food safety plan, is seriously considering the benefits of having their own farm food safety plan. So again, thank you very much, and thanks for joining us for tonight's workshop.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I'd like to invite any of our participants after we leave this workshop to fill out the post-workshop survey. That would be very helpful in our evaluations with the USDA and providing meaningful workshops for all of you in the future. So thank you again, Patrick, and I hope everyone has a good night.
Thank you.